Am I supposed to?
Thank you. I always tell him, please remind me to record because I will forget.
I was the one who forgot one of our sessions and we lost the whole thing. I was like, oh, man. So I've been down that road before.
Cool. Okay. Well, we've got 31 people joined so far, and I'm sure that people will join as a few minutes past the hour happens as normal. But I am going to pass it officially to Lori to kick us off.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to be here and welcome Sam into the realm of our world. So we are Coaching Agile Journeys. We're a group of volunteers who just came together and wanted to learn and grow and help each other. And then we figured out that we wanted to help other people too. So we're committed to living our Agile journey to the fullest and helping others do so as well. So we're highly committed to finding really good people and topics that help with our coaching and others as well. So we'd love to collaborate with others that are like-minded, and we're so glad you're here.
Yeah, and if you want to be a speaker or you know someone who would be an awesome speaker, then please feel free to reach out to us. We're all on social media, of course, Coaching Agile JO on Twitter, and all of our names. So we'd love to hear from you if you want to be a speaker or you know someone. So ScrumDo is our sponsor for these sessions, and you can try ScrumDo if you haven't tried it yet. And they've got a cool. What I like about ScrumDo is the team mood, because mood is so important and people don't think about that, but they have a team mood tracker inside the tool, which I found was really kind of cool.
I'm glad you caught me, because I was going to go back to building too.
Okay, so I am sharing my screen, and so Sam, if you would like to share your screen.
All right, I can start with me. But I'll very quickly hand it over to Isaac for our first poll. But welcome to Coaching Agile Journeys, as we've already covered that ground. So today we're going to be talking about coaching around resistance. Resistance is something we've all handled or dealt with in our Agile journeys, whether we have been the origins of that resistance or have had to coach others through it. Some of us have been on both sides of it. And I have myself been on both sides of it. So I am really interested in helping other people learn how to handle resistance and work with other people to get them through that emotional journey of learning how to engage with Agile. So before I introduce myself, I actually want to let Isaac launch the first poll. We're going to be using a tool called Slido that allows you all who are watching to give us some feedback and engage with us. So actually, I'm going to stop sharing. And Isaac, if you would put up the first poll and give them the overview of how Slido works.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a pretty simple app. You can access it from your phone or from your computer. And so if you just open a browser window and go to slido.com and then go to hashtag CAJ017, or I put a link in the chat you should be able to follow. And what happens is we've got a question here. And if you fill out what words come to mind when you hear the word resistance, what's happening is in real time we are building a word cloud from those answers. So everybody in the audience would go to slido.com. Coaching Agile Journeys, or CAJ017 is the hashtag, and just put in a word what comes to mind when you hear the word resistance. And we'll let that kind of permeate for a little bit, and I'll give it back to you there, Sam.
Okay. So we'll just, before we flip back to my screen, let's just take a look at what we're coming up. Change is the one that's got the biggest number of responses there. I see fear. I see pain. So that is all part of it. Fear is getting a lot of responses. What else have we got? Threatened. Yeah. Obstinance. I like that. Someone's got their thesaurus out. Control. Yeah, what else? The force. Futile. Oh my gosh, is one of the responses. What else? Someone said persistence. It moved. Futile's is gaining. I feel like I'm at the track.
The Borg.
Is the Borg on there? I don't see it.
No, but resistance is futile.
Oh, yes. Okay. So all of those things are come into play. Fear is a big, big part of resistance, and we'll talk a lot about that. So you should be seeing my spectacular sunrise over Tampa Bay. And but let me introduce myself a little bit first, because a lot of people don't know me. I am an Agile coach at AgileThought. We're a consulting firm, software development consulting firm with headquarters in Tampa, Florida. We also have an office in Atlanta, and we have engagements all over the country. I love to learn things. I'll take any class I can get my hands on, and as a result, I'm starting to build a little bit of an alphabet soup behind my name. I've only put on this slide my Scrum-related certifications, but I also have a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in English, and certifications in other arenas. In 1997, after I finished my master's degree in literature, I discovered that I really wasn't qualified to do anything. And fortunately for me, I had a long history of tinkering around with computers since junior high school. So I got into the IT sector. I started out on a help desk, very quickly moved into network administration, did some network engineering, and then jumped over to software development. I was a technical writer. From there, I got into quality assurance, became a testing lead, and then a Scrum Master, and of course now Agile Coach. I have a lot of hobbies, but the two that I spend the most time or have the most time for are creative writing and travel. I write crime fiction as a hobby, and my wife and I like to go to various places, and I like to travel even on business. That picture that you're seeing there is from Costa Rica 2 years ago at a wildlife reserve where this howler monkey that has curled up and fallen asleep in my lap can't be released. She was injured and taken in. And I don't know if you can see it in this picture. She's got a little baby. So right after feeding her, she grabbed her baby and climbed up and just crapped out in my lap for about 20 minutes. So those are some of my joys when I'm not acting as a coach. We'll cover a few different topics today in getting through what we want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about what resistance is, and also a little bit about what it is not. What behaviors do we see, and what behaviors should we not classify as resistance? Some general principles about coaching resistance. These are just generally good ideas to work with regardless of what type of resistance you're facing. At a very high level, the various reasons why people resist. And then the 4 categories that I refer to as dimensions of resistance that I borrowed from Mike Cohn, who is one of the great Scrum Master teachers right now. But before we do that, I want to throw our first multiple choice poll out there. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Isaac take over. And as soon as I figure out how to do that, stop share. Isaac, if you would put the second poll up. And this is a multiple choice answer. Select the answer that applies most to this statement. Resistance to an agile transformation is a sign that the organization is unhealthy. Do you strongly agree, strongly disagree, or something in between? I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Firmly on middle ground looks like is the is in the lead. Some form of agreement seems to, oh wow, that was some jump. All right. So for the most part, we neither agree nor disagree. There's also tied with that is both agree and strongly agree. 21%. Nope, neither agree nor disagree.
I think disagree is the big one there at the top, actually.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Yeah, it's the one right above it.
I'm like, I was wondering where it was. It's the one up on top. So disagree. Generally disagree is the strongest respondent. Thank you. I don't know why I like flaked out. It's blue on blue. I don't know. Maybe that's my problem.
No, it looks like a banner header.
I think that's what it was. It looks like a banner, and I just dropped right off of it. All right. So let me take control back. And start share again. And desktop 2. There we go. All right, so resistance is common. It's a natural reaction to change, and we'll talk about that definition in a minute. So yeah, if an organization is dysfunctional, you will see a lot more resistance than you might in others, but you will see resistance in perfectly healthy organizations that are dysfunctional but are just trying to embrace some change. It's really neither there. And, well, my clicker seems to have died. Resistance is neither new nor unique to Agile transformations. We talked about this a little bit before we started the webinar, but long before Agile became a thing, my father worked as an engineering manager in a hotel chain, and they decided to adopt TQM, Total Quality Management. My dad was a huge Deming fan. He read all the stuff, and he was really excited about this, and he saw the benefits of it, and he was just baffled that people pushed back at every level of the organization. And that was in the late 80s, early 90s, so long before Agile. This quote that I have put on the screen is by Paul Lawrence, who was a sociologist, also professor at the Harvard Business School. And he wrote this in 1969. And it really resonated with me the first time I saw it, especially that first part. It should not be thought of as something to be overcome. And that is why I titled this talk, Coaching Around Resistance, because we're helping people get around their natural objections to this change that really is necessary. It's a signal that something's getting out of adjustment, but it's not something necessarily negative. Trying to defeat resistance, on the other hand, or overcome it, does psychological violence to the people who we're trying to coach, and then they just resist even harder. This is the definition that I like most. I combined it out of a bunch of different consulting books and some other books and my own experience. It's a natural reaction. It is a reaction to specifically the emotional process of adapting to difficult change. Resistance is all about emotion. So frequently, and before I really learned this, in my early years as a Scrum Master, I would just try to overcome resistance by appeals to logic and laying out an argument for why they should just do this. Well, that wasn't working because I wasn't addressing the real issue, which was the emotion that lives behind resistance. So specifically then what I'm excluding from this is the idea of a rational objection to Agile. So, and what I mean by that is, let's say a new CEO comes into your organization and she calls you into her office after she gets settled in and says, listen, I've read a lot about Agile. I think I understand the concepts pretty well, but I disagree that it's the way we should go. I've had a lot of success with traditional project management methods. That's what we're going to do. That's not resistance. And that's not what we're talking about. That is a rational, logical decision. You may think that it is the wrong decision, but it's not resistance. People have the right to be wrong or to make a bad choice. The good thing is if someone does have a rational objection, you can counter that with logic and dialogue that isn't about the emotions behind it. But when we're talking about resistance, we are talking specifically about the emotional process. So we are helping people deal with that. There's some, before we dig into the nitty gritty of how those emotions express themselves and how to work with the resulting behaviors, so let's take a look at some of the general principles of coaching in that arena. I think that the most important thing you can do to reduce resistance is to make sure that the organization's leadership is fully committed to the transformation and actively engaged with it. If the C-suite is on board, they'll communicate that to the middle tier of managers and encourage them to engage, right? People generally prefer to hear about the need for change from their leaders. So if you get them on board and have them presenting the case for change, it kind of reduces the amount of resistance up front. And that executive sponsorship has to include more than lip service. The organization's incentives and practices are going to have to be realigned with Agile. You can't just drop Scrum on a team and expect it to work. So for example, if a company still rewards top performers, I had a friend worked for a company where most bugs found would get an award. That just encouraged hero behavior at best. And sometimes you get a little cutthroat competition going on that undermines the ability for anyone to truly embrace that change. Another thing is to establish credibility. That's also crucial. If you preach an Agile value or practice, you've got to be careful to exhibit that behavior that you're looking for, or people will turn off instantly. So it's a lot about you as a coach. Likewise, make the promises carefully that you're making and deliver on what you promise. And if someone expresses an objection to whether it's Agile in general or the framework that you're trying to teach, listen, acknowledge their observations, and don't try to tell them that they're not seeing what they're seeing. That old joke, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? Well, if they're going to believe their lying eyes, ask questions, engage in dialogue, and acknowledge those dangers. Once you build that credibility, it builds trust and goodwill that will pay dividends throughout your engagement if you're a consultant, or your coaching career if you're within the organization. Next general principle is individuals and interactions, and I chose that title deliberately from the Agile Manifesto because we sometimes forget about that and we get into the technical details of our frameworks, but creating personal rapport goes a long way. By understanding and listening to people, we get a better feel for what they're going through and how to help them through it. I always try to remember Stephen Covey's 5th habit of highly effective people: first seek to understand and then to be understood. If we communicate genuine interest in helping everyone in the organization adapt and adjust to new circumstances, we're going to get a lot farther in our coaching. Help them communicate their feelings. Sometimes people, again, resistance is all about emotion, an emotional reaction to change, but people can't always express that as well as they'd like. So we have to help them talk through it. And usually that is by asking open-ended questions to understand the source of that resistance, and then listening more than you talk. If you're talking more than 25% of the time, you may be doing more damage than good. Be honest, and try not to take it personally, especially if you get active, overt resistors. Sometimes they will get right in your face. There'll be some anger expressed. They're not reacting to you. They are reacting to the change. So even a personal attack is most likely not directed at you. So try not to take it personally. That's really hard. I can't say that it's something I've been able to do instantly. I have to take a deep breath, sometimes close my eyes and say, tell me more about that, when what I really want to do is shout back at them, but that won't help, will it? And suppression never works. As the Galactic Empire discovered in Star Wars, if you try to repress resistance, it's just going to pop up elsewhere. You only undermine your entire effort by trying to beat down resistance. And that can take the form of just insisting that they take yet another training class if lack of knowledge isn't the problem, but you're going to teach them. That turns them off right away. Or negative reinforcement strategies. So you punish someone for non-compliance. When I first started in Scrum, there was an advice that you should, as a team, agree that if someone was late to daily Scrum, they had to put $1 into a jar or do a funny song or a dance. And yeah, we tried that, and my team really did not like it because they felt like they were being punished rather than encouraged. So suppression just does not work. And then finally, the last of the general principles, and right after this we'll go to another poll, is give it time. Remember, Agile transformations take time. Even willing adopters, even the people who are really excited about a transformation, they love Agile, they're going to stumble. They're going to revert to old behaviors accidentally under stress. So coach them gently and give them time to make those changes. Recognize good faith efforts and celebrate the wins and successes that you get along the way. By the way, if you have questions during this, please either put it in the chat channel, and I can't see it from my screen because I'm sharing, but Heidi or Isaac or one of the others can let us know that we've got a question to talk through.
Yeah,
But
if you put it in Slido, then other people can vote it up, and the most popular questions will float to the top, and we'll answer those first. So post your questions in Slido.com using the CAJ017 tagline.
right. Thanks, Heidi. So let me just flip over, and Isaac, if you want to put up the next poll for us, that would be super. And here's the question. Some of these multiple choice questions are about fact, and some of them are opinion. What do you think? An engaged leadership should be involved in rooting out resistance and making sure that everyone gets on board. Okay, responses are rolling in pretty quick, and we mostly disagree. Okay. Does anybody want to make a case for agreeing with that statement? No? You'd rather remain silent. All right.
The word rooting out resistance kind of like is, comes in mind, like you want to pound it out of them somehow.
Right. Right. But I've seen people say that. And that's why I phrased it like that. An engaged leadership should certainly be involved in listening to a coach or a consultant when we come to them and say, hey, we're experiencing some resistance in this arena, and work with us to assuage the fears or give people the tools they need to get on board with the transition. But yeah, rooting out resistance is a little scary. It's a little command and control style. So that was why I put that up there. So let me take back control and we'll move on. So why do people resist? We've said it's an emotional reaction, but there are some reasons that contribute to those emotional, rejection of change. And there was a study that was published in 2016 in the journal Computers and Human Behavior. They surveyed 49 Agile coaches and Scrum Masters across 13 countries. And the study's authors compiled all of the responses they got into 5 broad categories. And they were talking about among software developers. And I know Agile's gone beyond software, but I'm talking for this purpose of this study, it's specifically software developers. Now, while they're listed as distinct reasons, each one of them feeds on and is fed by the others. So there's no like one problem to solve. It's a whole ecosystem of things you've got to deal with. And so this is where the first of there was some learning maps that were sent out. The first of them with the circles will come in handy. If you've printed it, go ahead and get that out because this may help you take some notes. This is what it looks like for those of you who didn't see it. There are 5 broad categories, 5 circles with plenty of white space for you to take some notes. And let's look at those. The most common response was lack of knowledge, which is surprising because we're talking about an emotional resistance. But really, no Agile transformation can succeed if the people going through it don't know what they're supposed to do or don't understand why they're supposed to do it. All that does is generate fear and shuts people down. So we really want to get some high quality training going on when we start an engagement, and we need that continuing education. I've seen and been subject to, here, 1 day of class, go. And even the most willing adopters will go off the rails really quickly if that's all they get. So we want continuing education because without that understanding and knowledge, respondents in that survey found that it contributed to really low morale, even more misunderstandings, misconceptions, unrealistic expectations of what teams could do, unrealistic expectations of what the business was supposed to do for the teams. So we really want to make sure that we are covering those bases. Cultural issues were cited by every single study participant as a major impediment to Agile transformation. I'm sure no one on this call has ever seen an organization that has such a history of traditional project management practices. They couldn't do Agile, right? one of my colleagues refers to those things as traditional methods of not getting anything done. Those types of organizations tend to have a host of other cultural values that just really incentivize people to reject agile transformation, even if the leadership wants it or pays lip service to it. They devalue collaboration. They've got a command and control structure that they just won't let go, and that leads to lack of trust. So again, this goes back to the general principles. We need to get the leadership on board. We need to get them engaged in the transformation, and we need to realign the company values, the organization's values, with Agile. Otherwise, employees just rightly perceive that Agile's just flavor of the month. And that was going back to the story about my dad in the hotel chain. There were managers who they didn't like the idea that anyone in the organization could say, hey, something's not going right, let's stop and look at it. They didn't want to give up that control. And so the people around my father, the reason he was seeing a lot of the resistance that he was seeing was they just figured this is going to go away as soon as we get a new executive. Sure enough, 2 years later, new executive team comes in, TQM went out, something else came in, and the whole cycle started all over again. The third response that they got was there's some people who just don't like change. You could offer to change them to a top floor with a stunning and spectacular view, and they would still be like, I don't want to. Mike Cohn refers to that as the conserver mindset. 25% of the people, the population, they just don't want change. But there's also that old habits die hard. We are so ingrained, especially people who've been in business for a long time and haven't experienced Agile before, doing things in this way. And even when we want to, under stress, the brain reverts to the old, well-established neurological pathways that we have, and we find ourselves in exhibiting old habits and patterns of behavior. And that can happen even to coaches. I was at a meetup recently. We were talking about Kanban, and the person doing the exercise gave us all the stuff and said, okay, go. And we all dove into the exercise. Not a single team stopped and said, let's set up a Kanban board. It was a lecture on Kanban, and we all knew that. But under stress, we went right back to what we had learned long ago. So good change management practices can help with that. And also, some people dislike change because they're afraid of the consequences that may accrue to them. They may lose their position. They may have to learn things that they don't feel capable of. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. The next most common response was that there was just that wrong mindset, that preference for control. They found that in addition to managers preferring to maintain control, some workers prefer to have a leader who's in control. And the reason they cited was that way they didn't have to worry about making a decision that ended up in failure. It wouldn't be their fault. So that mindset gets in the way. And finally, most people lack experience with collaboration, or good collaboration and cooperation. They don't know how to openly communicate and have to be taught how to do that. They don't know how to collaborate in groups, or they've had really bad experiences in that. If you were ever in a science class in high school where the teacher said, okay, we're all going to do group projects, and one person did all the work because they were invested in getting that A and everybody else just kind of sat back. I was the guy that sat back. So I got the A, which was awesome, but I didn't have to do any work. So that person probably somewhere in Orlando is enduring an Agile transformation going, oh yeah, right. So this is where we have those 5 things, 5 responses. Before we move on, I want to check in with another poll. And the question here is, do managers and employees resist Agile transformations for mostly similar reasons? Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing and let Isaac put that up. Same range of responses. 1 is strongly agree, 5 is strongly disagree.
I'm really liking the poll, by the way.
Thanks. Wasn't sure how they would work. I've never used this before. And y'all are speedy on getting on these polls too. This is.
I love the live
Dead
results.
tie right now.
What's that?
I love the live results. It's so fun to watch this live.
Yeah. We have an even split between agree and disagree, with strongly agree, kind of tipping the balance, I guess, towards yeah, they have mostly similar reasons. Oh, strips, another strongly late entrance for strongly agree. All right, let me move on. In fact, we find that is not actually true. In another study, it's an earlier study. Hold on, I'm trying to get back to my share. Mike Cohn, this is cited in Mike Cohn's book, Succeeding with Agile. We found very similar, they found very similar reasons, but that study tallied employee responses separately from manager studies. We found that there were two distinct sets of concerns that led to resistance. Employees, the number one thing was lack of awareness. They didn't know what they were supposed to do, right? So that goes along with that more recent study. They also were just afraid of what was going to happen, partly due to lack of awareness. They were afraid that their jobs would go away, and they were just concerned that leadership wasn't really involved. Meanwhile, managers mostly feared that loss of control and authority. They didn't know what was going to happen. I thought that the lack of time response was pretty interesting. We sometimes forget that managers have a lot of stuff that they have to do, and now we're asking them to do some extra things. We don't really necessarily give them the time they need to adjust to that. And so that was a big response. Also, what was in it for them? That's the WIIFM. I got lazy when I typed. What's in it for me? And they didn't have an answer to that. Why should they change? So that was where the executive leadership didn't communicate that need to change. And managers want to be involved in the redesign of the organization. They don't want to just walk in and be told, here's what you're doing today. So that caused a lot of resistance as well. So notice among the top reasons, regardless of whether they're employer managers, I don't think it's a good idea didn't make the list. Same thing with the more recent study, right? That's part of a rational response, again, which is not resistance, and that will respond well to logical arguments. And so now we get into the meat of things. How are we doing on time? Oh, good. We're doing great. So in order to determine how to respond to resistance, I find it's really helpful to identify what kind of resistance you're facing before you take any action, because there's so many seeming variables. I mean, there's so many different reasons that can individually be stated. I found that the two-dimensional matrix that Mike Cohn developed in Succeeding with Agile is really helpful. Now, he was talking about resistance specifically to Scrum, but it really applies more broadly to Agile as well. And so this is going to go into that second learning map that we distributed. So if you printed that out, that's the little square matrix thing. The first dimension is how resistance is displayed. So, all right, active resistance. I love that picture. Every dog I've had has done that to me. Active resistance or passive resistance. Active resistance, just what it says. Overt refusal to participate and may exhibit hostility, whether it's to you or to the framework or to Agile in general. They will maybe attempt to derail the transformation one way or the other, or just defend the status quo. And then passive resistance are the people who put a smile on it, but they don't actually do what they need to do to make the transformation work. They'll pay lip service to it. They will pretend to be bought in, but they won't actually engage. And they'll engage in a bunch of subtle little distractions that get in the way of adopting Agile. The other dimension is why they resist. So on the one hand, you have people who just prefer the status quo, whether it's because of fear, whether they have that conserver mindset. They know how things work now. They don't want to have to learn something new, and so they're going to resist. And then there's people who just actively dislike Agile. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that as well. Introverts, particularly, I've heard say, I got into software development, so I did not have to talk to people. And Agile means I have to interact. There's way too much interaction. Oh, Lori's raising her hand. What's that?
Yeah, me too. I started out my career as a technical writer, and I didn't have to deal with anybody. I could just go off on my own and just not have to handle people. So. Yeah.
I had a developer at one company who, he was just terrified of having to go into the retrospective and oh my God, I'm going to have to say something and someone might challenge me on that. We had to really work with him to get him to realize it's not such a bad thing. Others just have had bad experiences with Agile in the past, or they've heard horror stories from others who have. If you have some free time, Google Ron Jeffries' Dark Scrum.
Oh, yeah.
It's a marvelous article on Scrum done poorly, whether intentionally or not, and how it can damage. It can be damaging. So those two dimensions, those two axes combine into a 2x2 matrix of people who, 4 different basic categories of people that resist. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of those details, it's time for another poll. I like to do a lot of polls. I like to see what you guys are thinking, keep you on your toes. So let me get handed over to Isaac for the next poll.
You're just trying to make sure we don't fall asleep.
Right. So this is in the opinion vein. The question is, or the statement is, active resistance is more difficult to coach than passive resistance. What do you think? Answers are jumping around. A lot of response in disagree is seeming to win, whether it's strongly or otherwise. Cool. Would someone like to talk to that, whether it's to agree or disagree?
I can talk to agree.
Yeah.
I feel like the thing of passive resistance, I do think you need to be very sensitive in recognizing it. And I know a lot of people who, unless you're in their face, just don't really get it, right? Right. That no response is an affirmative response. And so if I were to say, let's do this thing, and then the other people just kind of don't say anything, they're quiet, whether they feel, just quiet or whatever, but they decide to sabotage it in the background without that being visible, it might not be handled, right? It might just sit in the background and mutate into something really ugly. So that's why passive can grow because it's not as visible. It can grow unseen and unchecked, and that can be really dangerous. Because when it surface, it can explode.
Yeah, someone in the chat window has written active resistance is more honest. It's easier to deal with honesty. That's true. It could go the other way, though. I mean, if you're really bad at conflict, active resistance is really hard to work with. So it's interesting. Most people disagree. They find passive resistance here. It's the quiet ones who kill you in your sleep. Nice, Ned. I like it. Ned is unknown to the rest of you. Used to serve on a Klingon warship. So, all right. Let me take back over and move on. And so let's start looking through these 4 categories. The skeptics, people who dislike Agile for whatever reason, and they offer passive resistance. We're not talking about healthy skepticism here. Prove it to me and I'll go along. It's more like just general doubt, and I'm going to doubt you no matter what you say. These types of resistors, basically, they doubt that Agile will work, or they doubt that it can work. And they believe that they just have to wait for it to fail on its own. So they don't have to take active a role in making it fail. It's just going to happen. They'll sit back with their arms crossed. So that can manifest as just silence, and we just talked about that, where they just, what Isaac just said and what Ned said, they won't say anything. Or they'll acquiesce without any commitment. And it's really hard to uncover, because even when you ask them specifically what they're thinking or feeling, I know one coach in the Tampa area about a year ago came to the Scrum Masters Guild and said, I have a problem. Can we talk about it? And so that, when I say that we need to do something, I've got a developer who just says, just tell me whatever you want me to do, and I'll do it. Except that then he wouldn't do it. So that was the skeptic. They can also stall. This is like the person who doesn't show up to the daily Scrum on time, comes to planning meetings without having looked at anything in the backlog, doesn't know what's going on, or may express like a seemingly sincere current concern with higher priorities. We don't really have time for the retrospective, because we got so much else going on. It's really important. Can't we just spend like 15 minutes? We're smart people. We can just knock a few things, put a few things on a list and take care of it. And it's disingenuous. Some of them will also propose alternatives. So you're introducing Scrum, and they'll be like, well, why don't we use Kanban? It's really hard to estimate our work, and it's really never accurate. So let's just use Kanban. Except that if you do use Kanban, they're going to disregard work in progress limits. They're not going to put all their work on the board. So again, it seems good, but it's really just a way to kind of stall or distract. All right, just checking the time. Coaching skeptics, continuing education works pretty well, especially if that skeptic behavior is growing out of lack of knowledge or understanding. Again, if they're really steeped in, they've heard horror stories, or they've just had a really bad experience, teaching them what it really means can help. Again, if that's not the problem, you don't want to go in that direction, so you have to ask those questions. People often will revert to status report, like participation in daily Scrum, for example, and they just don't understand the purpose of the event. And I had that at one place. I couldn't figure out why they kept just talking to the product owner, not to each other, and I kept trying to coach them, and it didn't click for me. I didn't really do a good job of coaching it until one of the developers said, well, what does a successful daily Scrum look like? Ha! He had no idea, neither did the rest of the team, what they were supposed to do as a result. And so then I coached them with that. The engagement increased dramatically after that. Skeptics can also respond well to a demonstrated track record of success. And so this is why a lot of organizations will pilot an Agile one team, then a few more teams, and that success of the first team and the teams that follow make it really a lot easier for skeptics to go, okay, maybe this is going to work, and get on board. And then a sneaky thing you can do is get them involved in making sure that the transition succeeds. So I just don't see how estimation is going to work. Put them in charge of making estimation work. That presents a win-win, right? They're going to look good if it succeeds. No one's going to remember that they said it wouldn't. They're going to remember that, look, it worked, and then the organization reaps the benefits. The danger here is that the saboteur, which we're going to talk about in a minute, can sometimes present as a skeptic. And if you put a saboteur in charge of making something work, they're going to blow it up deliberately. So let's talk about saboteurs. Dislike Agile, as the skeptics do, but they're going to take the active approach. They're going to try and undermine or blow up the transformation. And one of the most common ways to do that is challenge the credibility of Agile in general, or you as a coach. Again, this is where that don't take it personally comes into play. So this is actually how I found out about Dark Scrum. Was I had someone who was just scouring the internet for every bad story he could find about Scrum. And he said, well, Ron Jeffries says that Scrum is a failed methodology. What are you talking about?
Wow.
Yeah. So we're just going to practice Dark Scrum just like everybody else. I'm going to Google it on my lunch break. I'm like, oh my God, I have to talk about this.
Or
so
Agile
that is go ahead.
Agile is dead.
Agile is dead. That's actually a great talk. In fact, everyone should put that in the chat window. Look up this talk by I can't remember his name all of a sudden.
Was it Andy did that one? Andy Hunt?
Dave Thomas.
Dave Thomas. That's it.
Yeah. Agile is dead. And he's, of course, talking about how we've layered on a bunch of stuff that isn't necessarily, healthy. But some people will take that as say, see, Agile's dead. We should go on and move on to something else, or just go back to the old way of doing things. Skeptics will just continue their old behaviors. They're perfectly willing to estimate the backlog. You may have a product owner that's like, okay, yeah, well, I'll let the team estimate the backlog. And then they take that backlog and they slot it into the next 10 sprints. Here's my project plan. And ta-da, we're Agile because it's got sprints, right? So that's a common saboteur technique. And then just flat out refusal to participate. One company I was at had been trying to adopt Scrum, hadn't done very well with it. They asked me to lead one team into just strict, let's just do Scrum as it's written. And one of the developers led a revolt. He tried to actually get the entire team to walk out of a sprint planning because he thought it was a waste of time. And he got 2 of the developers to walk out with him. It was pretty disruptive to the team. So what do you do with saboteurs? This is, again, where active and engaged leadership can come in, because if the leadership shows support for this transformation, it makes it really clear that the organization is committed to the transition and won't let it be derailed. It kind of causes saboteurs to back off a little bit. Dialogue helps. Talk to someone who is engaging in this behavior and find out why. You've got to do it gently. You've got to do it carefully, because the first reason they give for resistance might not be the actual reason, or might not tell the whole story. So engaging in that dialogue and listening to their concerns, listening to their fears, and addressing those, you can uncover a core problem that can be addressed. And you can turn a saboteur into your biggest supporter if you can show them that look, this really does work, and the thing you're most afraid of, we're gonna make sure that we keep that in mind and deal with it. Just like skeptics, saboteurs will sometimes respond to that track record of success. And in extreme cases, you may need to remove a saboteur from that team, from that project, and in an extreme case, maybe even from the organization. I mean, I hate to sound negative, but sometimes there really isn't an easy way to handle it. In that case that I talked about, the ringleader had to be removed from the project. He wasn't coached out of the company, and he did become a pretty valuable contributor on another team. Diehards like the status quo. Now we're on the left side of that diagram. They like the status quo, and they're going to actively resist changing. They don't really have a strong opinion about Agile itself. They just emotionally committed to the status quo, and they're going to try and rally others to defend it and maintain it in much the same way that a saboteur might. They'll attempt to stall in a different way than the skeptics. These are often like trying to control access to people so that the transition can't start. So a diehard might try to prevent teams from stabilizing by moving people around constantly, or splitting. Well, we're going to have Tom on 50% of his time on this project and 25% over here, and it just causes that problem, as we all know, that doesn't work very well. So they'll do little things like that to try and just keep the transition from getting started. Their favorite phrase is, well, here in the real world. And if I had $1 for every time I have heard someone tell me about how Agile doesn't work in the real world, I would be retired today, probably. They'll concede that Agile works in theory, but they're just constantly going to cite real world or why it won't work in this organization, or in this division, or in this product, or this team. So even if it's working somewhere else in the organization, they're going to tell you that it doesn't work here. And then they'll tinker around the edges. The diehard's going to grudgingly allow some Agile behavior. So again, if you've got Scrum that you're going to adopt, say, okay, that's fine. We'll let the teams do Scrum. But they resist the idea of reforming the teams along feature lines, so they're on their functional silos. So you still get the bottlenecks, dependencies aren't resolved, and it doesn't work very well. And then they use that as evidence that Agile doesn't work. Some of the anti-saboteur methods will also work with diehards, but the most powerful thing you can do is generate dissatisfaction with the status quo. Not with everybody else, with them. Pointing out where there are shortcomings and having them acknowledge and recognize those will do a lot towards defanging the diehard. There's a really good example of that in Jeff Sutherland's book, Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, from his experience as a training commander for his cadet company at West Point. His company was perpetually at the bottom of parade formation rankings. And so he just started posting up a list of what had gone wrong. Didn't point any fingers, just this happened, this happened, this happened. And by just showing people what was going wrong, the entire company began to transform and became the top ranked company. And then diehards, again, they like the status quo, and that may well be because they're afraid of change. So working with them to surface and resolve the fears that are generating this behavior can really help coach them. And then the final category are the followers. They like the status quo for many of the same reasons the diehard might, but they're not going to actively resist it. They're just going to go with the path of least resistance, and they will follow whoever the strongest voice is. So if you've got strong, loud diehards and loud saboteurs, they're going to follow that. So one way to handle them is to put them with, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, but put them with people who are happy about the transformation and make sure that the right voices are talking. Followers tend to be pragmatists. They've seen other change initiatives fail, seen them come and go. So they figure Agile's flavor of the month. They'll wait it out. And they'll engage in what I call mom and dad are gone behavior. They'll do what you're asking them to do while the coach is around. As soon as the coach's back is gone, they revert to the old behaviors. So coaching followers is about positive reinforcement of whatever Agile behavior you see. When they do exhibit some thinking that is in line with Agile, make sure that it's recognized. One team I coached, there was a developer who didn't see the point of the team owning all the work and helping each other out until one of the testers, whom she was really close friends with, got really overwhelmed toward the end of the sprint, and she jumped in to help out this tester. And so I just pulled her aside and said, hey, it was really great the way you pitched in to help out the team. And then in the retrospective, the team also thanked her for it, not prompted by me. And she really started getting involved in subsequent sprints. She was really much more likely to walk over to another developer and say, hey, I'm done with my thing. Is there anything I can help you out with? Or pick up some testing work, or work with the product owner to start refining the backlog. So that positive reinforcement really helps. As I said, you can pair a follower up with, and pairing here, I'm not talking about pair programming, I'm talking get them involved with people who have actively engaged in the transformation or happy about it. Sometimes it's even worth taking the temporary, wow, my brain just flatlined, the temporary productivity hit by reorganizing teams a little bit to get followers involved on the same team with people who are happy about the transition, sort of a corporate swim with a buddy method of getting people engaged with Agile. Just like skeptics, you can sometimes get them involved with making that transition work, and continuing education also works with followers. So those are the 4 categories of resistance, and we have another poll. So Isaac, if you'll put the next poll up, and the next statement that I want you to think about is, regardless of the type of resistance, additional training is an appropriate tool to consider. What do you think? Okay, this is a little closer. Have mostly agreements, I think. No? Yeah.
Not what I thought.
Say that again?
The results are a little bit different than I thought.
What did you think?
I thought that people were going to say training is not going to be appropriate if people are just resisting, like from emotional reasons, and training wouldn't necessarily help.
Right.
But yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm curious to see what you say.
Yeah, somebody else started to talk.
Oh.
I thought.
Anyone else want to chime in? There's a ton of people here.
So it's kind of a funny wording. Certainly you can consider it, but the important thing to remember is that it isn't always appropriate to actually engage in. So that's I was a little sneaky when I put that one together. I would say, as you said, consider why they're resisting before you jump right to I'm gonna engage in training, because as you said, people who are resisting out of fear, they're not going to engage with training. People who understand what you want them to understand but just don't like it, don't want to do it, or are afraid they can't learn it, that maybe that's not the appropriate thing. So we only have about 6 minutes left. Do we have any Q&A that we want to engage with?
Yes, we have some. If I could have the presenter again, I'll share my screen.
Absolutely. Let me cancel my stop share. Okay, go ahead. Oops.
Our number one
question. To come through.
Our number one question that came through with 10 upvotes on Slido was, any tips on how to deal with resistance at the executive level?
So yeah. That can look like you've got one champion and other executives are like, yeah, I don't think so. That's a hard one, and I don't have a lot of experience at that. I would be curious to see what some of my co-hosts have to say about that.
I was responding to a question. Does someone else want to take that? I didn't hear the question.
Any tips on how to deal with resistance at the executive level? An example I gave was like, you've got one champion, maybe the CTO really is hot for Agile, but the CEO, the CFO, they're all like, yeah, no, that's not for us.
Well, yeah, I think this is Jeff. I think it's a big risk avoidance at that level. There's a lot at stake. I mean, these people are in very high profile positions, so they're very cautious and they move cautiously. And, the best way that I could ever penetrate that is, one, you educate them through metrics, through historical data, systems that have worked, and good examples. And the other thing is to convince them to try something on the much smaller, less riskier scale. And I think you'll have a lot more momentum that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's really important, just as with any other coaching or resistance coaching strategy. First, listen to why they're resisting. Ask them that question. Why don't you like this? Well, not like, that's not quite the right thing. Well, why are you not on board with this? What would help you get on board? That's a great question you can ask, whether it's the executive level or so. What would help you be comfortable with this transformation? And then listen. Because sometimes they'll tell you, you may have to dig a little deeper, but people give them that option. And I kind of want to hit the second question too, while we still have a couple of minutes. Leadership said they're on board. However, they keep falling into old habits, keep shoulder tapping and getting too involved in the details. How do we help them? And that's a great question. And I think that you have to, one strategy for that is to make them aware of the costs. Here is what happened. Here's why we've had 3 sprints in a row where we haven't completed all the work, because this new work came in. Is that what you want? Ask them the question. Is that acceptable to you? Maybe it is acceptable to them, and then you have to maybe adjust. Maybe Scrum isn't right. Or ask them to, hey, can we just have 2 sprints where you don't do that? No matter how bad you think it is, can we, just back off? And ask them for that experiment. See how it goes. So that might be one way to work with that. It just really goes back to asking questions. Heidi?
Yeah, I love the idea of experiments, and that's something that I always propose. The smaller the experiment, the better. If somebody is really resistant to it. So, I had a developer say, I want to be a Scrum Master. Okay, well, let's try a little experiment. But if it's in the executive level, frame it around what problem are we trying to solve, and let's say, how would Agile help solve your problem? So kind of go back to what you said, what's in it for me? Try to solve their problem.
Right.
If it's, we can't deliver something on time, then breaking it down smaller will help us deliver, and at least you'll be transparent. So yeah, try to frame it from their perspective.
Yeah. What's in it for me is really powerful.
Yeah, I think in that dimension, asking what they're rewarded for, what their scorecard looks like,
Yeah.
So true.
What kinds of things, because ultimately in most cases, they want the same things that we want, but they maybe aren't aware of the cost of doing something the way they've been doing it. And we've had teams that respond and say, well, if that's what you want us to do, we'll do that, but understand here's the cost. Like pulling people out of a team for a week or two to work on something hot project.
Absolutely.
You can do that. It's your prerogative. You own the resources, but here's what it's going to cost you. And in the case of breaking commitments to a delivery, a release, a product, there have been a few cases where an exec will say, oh my gosh, no, let me find another way to get this done. You guys stay on track, get the job done. We've sold that. We want you to do it.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the first company I was with that used Scrum, we had professional services kept coming in, and they had their favorite developer, and they'd ask him to do this, and he would do it for them. And finally, when I found out about it, when it hit me, I went to that particular person and said, here's what's going on. I understand you need this, but here's what it cost you. Here are all the defects that got introduced because we distracted somebody, that you then had to come shoulder tap about getting those fixed. So maybe if we backed off a little, our quality would be better. And that worked really well. We are at 5 o'clock. Can I share my contact information real quick for everyone? You can reach me on the web at samfalco.com. You can give me a shout out on Twitter at stfalco. My LinkedIn connection is there. And if you have questions or want some more information, feel free. There's my email address. I really appreciate you all for attending and participating.
Yeah, this was an awesome session. Thanks, everybody. We had a high of like 64 people attending.
Wow.
Thanks, everybody, for the polls. And we'll be posting this at coachingagilejourneys.com in just a couple of days with the content here.
Cool.